Margaret always believed that long marriages erased the possibility of secrets. After 32 years with Thomas Reed, she thought she knew the rhythm of his silence, the meaning behind his tired smiles, the comfort in the way he folded his hands at the dinner table before eating. He was not a dramatic man. He was steady, predictable, safe. Every Saturday, for as long as she could remember, Thomas left before sunrise and returned after dark. He said he was going to the farm, 40 miles outside town. The property had belonged to his father, and when his father passed, Thomas kept it. Margaret had visited once, early in their marriage, just once. She remembered tall grass, an aging farmhouse, and Thomas acting strangely tense the entire time. When she suggested they spend a weekend there together, he refused gently. "It's not a place for you," he said. At first, she laughed it off. She assumed he meant the hard labor, the dirt, the lack of comfort. But when she asked again a few months later, his answer was firmer. No. No explanation, no discussion. Over time, Margaret stopped asking. Marriage, she believed, required trust. Thomas provided well. He never stayed out late beyond Saturdays. He never hid his phone. He kissed her every morning before work. They shared holidays, grief, laughter. That had to be enough. But something about the farm always lingered in the back of her mind, like an unfinished sentence. Then, one cold Tuesday morning in November, Thomas collapsed in the kitchen. One moment he was pouring coffee. The next, he was on the floor. The ambulance lights flashed against their windows, turning the walls red and blue. Margaret sat in the hospital hallway clutching his wedding ring after the nurse handed it to her. He didn't make it. Just like that, 32 years ended in a sentence. The funeral passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences. Neighbors spoke about what a good man he was. Co-workers talked about his reliability. Margaret stood by the casket, touching the polished wood, waiting to feel something other than numbness. That was when she saw her. Across the cemetery stood a woman Margaret had never seen before. Older, thin, wrapped in a gray coat. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She wasn't crying loudly. She simply watched the coffin descend into the ground with an expression Margaret couldn't name. It wasn't shock. It wasn't pure grief. It was something heavier, personal. Their eyes met. For a moment, the woman looked as if she might walk away. Instead, she slowly approached. Up close, Margaret could see how pale she was, frail, almost fragile, but her eyes were sharp. "You're Margaret," the woman said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Margaret replied, confused. The woman nodded once, glancing toward the grave. "He never stopped trying." Margaret's chest tightened. "Trying what?" But the woman didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned slightly closer and said something that would echo in Margaret's mind all night. "You should go to the farm." Then she turned and walked away before Margaret could ask another word. That night, Margaret sat alone in the quiet house. Thomas's chair sat empty. His slippers still rested beside the couch. The silence felt different now, thicker. She thought about the will the lawyer had read earlier that afternoon. Everything was straightforward. The house, the savings, the truck, all left to her. But the farm had one strange instruction. The property shall remain untouched. Untouched? Why? Thomas had never spoken of selling it, but he never explained why he kept it either. And now that mysterious woman had mentioned it. Margaret tried to convince herself it didn't matter. Grief makes people dramatic, she thought. Perhaps the woman had been a distant relative, a former neighbor. Still, she couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach. For 32 years, she respected the boundary Thomas had set. For 32 years, she chose not to question him. But Thomas was gone now, and whatever secrets he kept were buried with him, unless they weren't. Around midnight, Margaret stood up from the couch and walked to the hallway closet. She reached into Thomas's coat pocket and pulled out his truck keys. Her hands trembled. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Another woman? A debt? Something shameful? Or nothing at all? But for the first time in 3 decades, Margaret decided she deserved answers. At dawn, she would drive to the farm he always forbade her to visit, and she would finally see what her husband had been protecting, or hiding. The drive to the farm felt longer than Margaret remembered. The highway stretched endlessly, trees blurring past her window as early morning fog hovered low over the fields. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel with every mile. When she finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the property, her heart began pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The farmhouse stood quiet and weathered, its white paint slightly faded. The porch swing creaked gently in the wind. It looked less like a secret and more like a place frozen in time. Margaret stepped out of the truck slowly. The air smelled like hay and cold earth. Inside the house, everything was neat. Too neat. The bed was made perfectly. Dishes were washed and drying beside the sink. A stack of folded blankets rested on the couch. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt maintained. She moved from room to room, touching small details. A coffee mug still sat on the counter. A book lay open beside the armchair. Thomas had been here just days ago. Then she noticed something odd. 2 cups in the sink, not one. Her breath caught. Margaret stared at them for a long moment before turning toward the window. Behind the house stood the barn, large, closed, and secured with a heavy padlock that looked almost new. Her pulse quickened. Why would Thomas lock the barn so carefully? She returned to the kitchen, scanning drawers. Nothing. She checked under the table, behind the curtains, along the shelves. Finally, under a cabinet near the sink, her fingers brushed against something taped underneath. A ring of keys. Margaret froze. Thomas had hidden them. Her hands trembled as she walked back outside. Each step toward the barn felt heavier than the last. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grass around her feet. She stood before the barn door and inserted the key. The lock clicked open. For a moment, she considered turning back. Whatever was inside could change everything she believed about her husband. But she pulled the door open. Sunlight filtered through narrow wooden slats, casting long beams across the dusty floor. The scent of hay mixed with something softer, something lived in. And then she heard it. A cough. Not an echo. Not her imagination. A real cough. Margaret's heart stopped. Someone was inside. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner of the barn, partially hidden behind stacked hay bales and a small wooden partition, she saw movement. An arm, thin, wrapped in a blanket. And then a face. The woman from the funeral, sitting quietly in an old armchair, waiting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret stood frozen near the entrance of the barn, while the woman watched her calmly, as if this meeting had always been inevitable. "You found me," the woman said softly. Margaret swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Up close, Margaret could see how fragile she was. Pale skin, tired eyes, but there was something steady in her expression. "My name is Eleanor." The name meant nothing to Margaret. "I was his first wife." The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret staggered back slightly, gripping the barn door to steady herself. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He told me she died." Eleanor gave a faint, almost sad smile. That's what he needed to say. Margaret's mind raced. 32 years of marriage flashed before her. Birthdays, holidays, quiet evenings, shared grief. Had all of it been built on a lie? "He never divorced me," Eleanor continued gently. "We were young, stubborn. We separated when he left town for work. Papers were never filed. Pride kept us apart." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. "So he lived 2 lives?" she demanded. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No, not like you think." She explained that they hadn't spoken for decades. Thomas had built a life with Margaret, while Eleanor stayed in a small apartment in another town. She never remarried. Neither did he, legally. 10 years ago, Eleanor became ill. No children, no close family. When Thomas found out, he went to see her. "He looked older," she said softly. but he looked guilty. Margaret's breathing grew shallow. "He brought me here," Eleanor said, glancing around the barn, "not because he loved me the way he loved you, but because he couldn't live knowing he left me alone. Every Saturday, every single Saturday." Margaret thought of all those weekends, the quiet dinners alone, the excuses, the way he returned home, tired but peaceful. "He told me about you," Eleanor continued. "He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. He said you deserved honesty, but he was ashamed." Margaret felt tears welling up. Ashamed of what? Of loving someone before her? Of failing to close a chapter properly? "He didn't want to hurt you," Eleanor whispered. And he didn't know how to explain that he was trying to fix a mistake from his youth. Margaret leaned against a hay bale, her world rearranging itself. This wasn't betrayal in the way she feared. This was unfinished history. Pain carried quietly. Thomas hadn't been unfaithful in love. He had been loyal to guilt. And now, standing in the barn he locked so carefully, Margaret realized the farm wasn't a place of secrets. It was a place of atonement. Margaret didn't leave that day. She could have walked out, driven home, pretended she never opened the barn, but something held her there. Perhaps it was the weakness in Eleanor's voice. Perhaps it was the thought of Thomas sitting in this same space every weekend, carrying the weight of his past alone. Margaret went inside the farmhouse and found ingredients in the pantry. Soup, simple, warm. As it simmered on the stove, she stared out the kitchen window toward the barn. For years, she imagined something dark happening here. Instead, she found something painfully human. When she carried the bowl to Eleanor, the older woman looked surprised. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," Margaret replied softly. They sat together as daylight faded. Eleanor spoke about Thomas when he was young, impulsive, ambitious, afraid of failure. Margaret spoke about the man he became, steady, thoughtful, devoted. Two versions of the same person, neither false, just unfinished. As night fell, Margaret stepped outside and looked up at the wide country sky. The stars stretched endlessly above the fields. She tried to imagine Thomas sitting here, torn between past and present, trying to be honorable in the only way he knew. He should have told her. Yes, but perhaps he believed silence was protection. Margaret felt the anger inside her slowly soften into something else. Understanding. In the morning, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Eleanor would not stay hidden in a barn anymore. Thomas had spent 10 years caring for a chapter he never closed. Margaret would not let that effort die with him. Weeks passed. Margaret began splitting her time between the house in town and the farm. She cleaned the barn properly, moved Eleanor into the farmhouse bedroom, arranged medical visits. They didn't become best friends overnight. Grief and awkwardness lingered between them, but so did honesty. One winter morning, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. Margaret buried her beside Thomas, under the same wide sky that once held his secrets. At the edge of the property fence, Margaret placed a small wooden sign, "No more secrets." Because the farm was never about betrayal. It was about a man who didn't know how to confess his guilt, and a woman who finally understood that love is rarely simple, but sometimes, even in silence, it tries its best to do right.